Welcome everyone, and I'm Henry Adams, a professor of American art at Case Western Reserve, and we have two fascinating guests, Romy Owens from Oklahoma City and Chris Pekoc from Cleveland, who have a joint show at the Amarillo Museum of Art. And why don't we start with you, Romy, and maybe we can just start with looking at one of your works in this exhibition. You can tell us a little bit about what it is and how you did it.
Well, in looking at this particular image, my work is all based upon photographs that I then hand sew together. And what we're looking at here in this image is something that is a relatively large piece. This measures 4 feet in height and 78 inches in width. So, you know, it's a sizable piece. In the beginning of my work, and this is an earlier piece for me, I really liked the idea of emulating what I saw in quilt makers and in tapestry, but doing it in a non-functional way. So the idea of kind of replicating that, but out of paper, but still attending to the detail of each stitch being significant, I thought that was kind of lovely. I love the use of...
Looking close,
yeah,
you can
so
see the stitching.
Here you can see my measured stitches, and it's definitely there's a cadence and a rhythm to it in terms of what I think of when I think of how people treat prayer beads or rosary beads, or even just thinking about how a metronome has this tick-tock, and I can't help but think about, you know, the days in which I played a musical instrument and that there was this thing. And so in the process of creating these, that stitch work, that needlework becomes very rhythmic and meditative in that way for me.
And this is all hand sewn. This is not a sewing machine that you're using.
Right.
And you put these are photographs of textures, really.
They are, yeah. So
and there's sort of a sense of place that you're evoking.
Right. In fact, place is very important to me when I think about when I go out and photograph locations. I'm looking for texture, color, repetition, and line, but I think a lot about history and the history of place, and you think about distressed and torn down buildings within a community, and when those were built, they were somebody loved that. Like, somebody built this with great intention and pride, and how over time they weather and they decay, and if you don't keep up with it and keep up the facade, you see this aging that happens, and it happens to us as well. So I like the idea that these are portraits of buildings, that I'm capturing details of a moment in time in the life of a building, because we all know that buildings don't last forever. I mean, everything decays over time, and I think that that's really an interesting aspect of what I'm trying to capture. And then the idea that these places really are kind of regarded in eyesores, and that we like texture, but we don't like graffiti, or we don't like distress to that. Like, we want things to look nice in general in our surroundings. So I take these images of what are distressed buildings, and then I piece them together into what I think are beautiful, like a reconfiguration.
So there's a kind of beauty to the damage that these places have suffered.
Yeah.
Maybe you can say something about how the sewing interacts with the images, because sometimes it's connecting two things, sometimes it's running through the photograph, it seems.
Well, the way I came to sewing my work together was purely out of function. It was a necessity to bind one piece of paper, one photograph to another, which I know that Chris and I have that in common in terms of a functionality. And it becomes a decorative element because it's there and it's hard not to acknowledge it. It becomes its own form of line. And you see in this image particularly where you've got this linear quality to the thread that almost seems like I'm making a line that goes in there, but still at the same time, every single time I'm placing a needle to paper and creating these seams, it is always functional. Like, it is not meant to be a decorative element. All three of these lines are there to serve a function, to keep paper together.
And if we could only turn it around and see the back,
Yeah.
we'd see there's,
Right.
as it were, another work of art on the back.
Yeah, the backs become a different thing, yeah.
These are notations and things that are, this is a view of the back that
Right.
maybe you can tell a little bit about that.
I would be just as curious to know if the backs of Chris's works, if you find them just as interesting in thinking about, like it does become a different piece of art. Like this one is clearly the backs of photographs that are white paper, and that photographs well to present to the audience or to viewers so that they can kind of see. But typically I will use scraps of other photographs, and that will become a whole second-sided thing that happens. But any time in the process of sewing work together, when I come to a point where I need to end a line of thread and tie a knot, I make a note of the time, of the day, of what I am thinking about, or what I'm watching, because I'd taken a lot of media content in the process of creation, either music or movies or television programming through my computer, and so it becomes a whole thread of what I was doing at the time. And I think in this particular note, if I remember correctly, I had just made some lentil soup, so the recipe for lentil soup is included in that, and certainly some notes about what I'm thinking. I think that I have a lot of friends and family members who have seen then works on display where both sides, and maybe I'm on the phone with my sister, for example, and she'll read that and say, I can't believe that you wrote that down on the back of your work. But it becomes a diary for me where it became a way of me being able to track how long it was taking in this process. But now it's kind of become a therapy in a way of being able to...
There's a kind of meditative aspect.
Let me interrupt for just a second, because Romy said something about the backs of my work and what it looked like. I was involved in an exhibition that traveled to 3 separate locations. I had 2 pieces, and they were unframed. They were attached to the wall with pins. At one point, at one of those locations, they reversed the piece and hung it backwards. And
And you got a good review for the first time,
exactly. Well, they sent me a photograph of the installation. I never went to see the show. Otherwise, I wouldn't have known.
That's great. There's a famous case at the Museum of Modern Art where there was a Picasso that was hung upside down for years, and finally some visitor.
That happened to a piece of my work as well.
Well, why don't we move on to you, Chris, and if Romy's works resemble patchwork quilts, you're a little bit more like Dr. Frankenstein, I think.
I've had that comparison. And to Silence of the Lambs, but I'm not really fond of either of those. I do cut up images and piece them back together again. And the sewing, as Romy said, it became an element that was important to me because I had to join 2 things together. But there's another aspect of it, and especially with the figurative work. In life, we all have our setbacks, and we have to somehow put ourselves back together and move forward after a setback. It could be a loss of a loved one. So the stitching has to do with the psychological damage that we encounter, and then the repair of that as we go forward.
And of course your studio is a fascinating place. You pull out drawers and there's a drawer of photographs of eyes or hands or whatever. Snakes.
Birds.
Yeah. You do seem to have a sort of repertory of things you'd like to collect. Now, your family was involved in the hardware business. Your studio is sort of a demented version of a hardware store.
Well, what happened over the years, when I first started, I've been doing sewn together work since 1988.
Yeah.
And over that time, I accumulated a lot of shape. I always get more material to make a piece than is really required.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of surplus. And I started to store the surplus, as you say, in these drawers, probably 60 of them, different drawers with different, and I save all the scraps, because I found that the scraps, the cutaway pieces, could be worked into a new piece, and what's interesting about that from my point of view is that the scraps, I could not dream up the scrap shape.
Yeah.
It's something that happened.
As the process of cutting something else
Right.
out, yeah.
And so I come up
new-
with these images that
Yeah.
were beyond my ability to. They're often very startling. Little leftover pieces that get reinserted into a new piece. So the work is very organic. It just keeps generating over and over and over
Now,
again.
Romy, you must also have things that are left over after a piece.
I
Do you
do, yeah.
do you reuse those, or
I do, yeah. And every once in a while, I will just absolutely in a clutter way, literally just all the paper's gone, and I will just start over brand new from scratch. But yeah, for long times, I'd have stacks and stacks of scraps of paper and boxes, and just kind of know, I remember that there's some blue in there, and go
Well,
Now,
cull
now
through
most
it.
of your things are one place, or do you sometimes mix places?
I mix places. I do. I do like the idea of finding a palette within a place, and so this work is all Amarillo driven, and I came last year and photographed, and I do like to do that, but there
So it's
certainly
like
are.
assembling a place and pulling it together in a
Right.
different
Yeah.
way, yeah.
Well, I just wanted to interject about the leftover shapes that I have. My studio walls are made out of bulletin board material, and the walls are just solid with
Yeah.
shapes
Cork.
that are pinned up.
Oh, nice.
So some of them are works in
Oh, yeah.
progress.
I feel like I've seen an image. I wish we could have that image. People will go look for it, I'm sure, if they want to. It's online, accessible. There's a great image of you in your studio with
With the
where
two
you can see
two
everything.
sewing machines
Yeah,
and,
it's really
and
fantastic.
the wall behind me that's of these pinned up
Yeah.
objects. In fact, I'm having a show at the Akron Art Museum in Ohio in the fall, and they wanted to take a studio wall and put it into the exhibition. I think we've sort of nixed that idea, but that was a concept that came up. But those shapes then are things that I can react to. If they go into a drawer, I remember, yeah, there are like 40 hands in this drawer, but I don't remember each hand.
Yeah.
So if it's on the wall, then I see it, and
Yeah.
and it often gets used more readily.
Now, you've gone through quite an evolution, because you actually started off making drawings, as I remember. That was your first.
That's right.
And-
Well, when I first started in my early 20s, being serious about, or at least it turned out that was the point where I became serious about being an artist, I took photographs of my subjects and their faces and their hands, which I find interesting because hands are so important to my work today. The photographs were Polaroids, so I didn't need a darkroom, and I never showed the Polaroids. I just used them as a sketchbook for the drawings, and sometimes I preferred to work from the photograph because the presence of who I was drawing often just made me feel odd, and it compromised the outcome of the work. So, so I used the photographs to produce the drawings, but never showed them. So that was an early introduction to photography, which I see now as opened the door for me to use photography more extensively in my work.
And then you went on to sort of photorealist paintings. And
That was a time when Andy Warhol's work was everywhere in terms of the art community. And yes, I did, but I still relied on photographs to create those images, and I worked with an airbrush to try to make the image, my painted image, look so much like the original.
Amazing.
And then that became dreadfully boring after a while, and that's why I stopped. But I was using, for those paintings, I used collages that were cut from magazine pages as the inspiration as my sketch for the paintings.
Yeah.
So I was starting to use collage at that point too. So
And you might say, because there are two major pieces that come to mind. There's one that's related to Kent State. You might say something about that.
I went to Kent and then dropped out of school for 6 years and went back to Kent in 1970. And that's when the students were shot.
Yeah.
And I was right in the area where I'd come out from classes at noon, and there was a big rally going on, and the SDS, Students for Democratic Society, were speaking, and a lot of us were sitting on an area, it was like a natural amphitheater, listening to them, and that's when the guardsmen had already taken over the campus, but that's when they surrounded all of us. I wasn't really demonstrating, but I was listening, but we were surrounded, and then suddenly, I never heard the shots, But suddenly on the other side of the knoll, some of my fellow students were running back over the knoll shouting obscenities at the soldiers and holding the cartridge cases.
Yeah.
And then an ambulance went tearing across.
So you didn't
lawn.
even quite know what was going on?
No,
Yeah.
not until I got home.
Yeah.
And
So you watched it on the news?
I watched it on the news.
Wow.
Yeah.
Right.
And then that's that painting that you did.
I did a large painting relating to it, using metaphors for the soldiers,
Yeah.
or for the guardsmen and for the student, and used these were all photographs from magazines that I sort of cobbled together to make the painting, which was I think 5 by 8 feet, so it was a fairly large piece, diptych.
And then you did that big painting in the Cleveland Public Library also.
And that was collage based.
Yeah.
That started with a collage that was this big, and the mural itself is 20 feet wide and 35 feet high.
Yeah.
So it taught me that I could translate something
Yeah.
small and successfully. The strange thing about that was I never saw that painting in its completed, because it was so big I had to paint half of it. I couldn't buy canvas wide enough. So I bought 12-foot canvas and did half of it on 12 feet and then the other half on another 12 feet, and then it was all trimmed down and then placed in this architectural niche.
Yeah.
And I never really saw it until it was up on the wall. The workmen, I hired a crew to assemble it, and it was glued to the wall like wallpaper on the wall.
Yeah.
I mean, it was a little more complicated than
Yeah.
that.
So that's a very wonderful space, which I guess, there's that mural by William Summer done in the 1930s, but I guess they ran out of money or something for 50 years.
Yeah,
And then,
right, they did. I
had
think you read about it.
Now, tell us something about this image we're looking at here. Most of the images you can tell what they are, but this one.
This one is based on graffiti that I found in my neighborhood in various areas. And I was working with a studio assistant at the time, and we took these large sheets, transparent sheets of film, which I work on anyway, and happen to have around, and we taped it over the graffiti, and then we traced the graffiti and then layered it. This is a combination of several layers of graffiti. I thought it was very beautiful. And so I did 3 pieces. One of them was stolen in a rather dramatic break-in. It's never surfaced since. The second one...
You might tell about that. That was a good story. It's the beginning of some mystery story about... No, go ahead.
Well, the work, that first piece was stored in a location where the Cleveland Clinic housed work that they wanted the doctors to view. The Cleveland Clinic was planning to buy the piece, but they wanted to find a doctor who wanted to have it in his or her office. So there was this sort of gallery setting in a somewhat remote part of the city where and this was New Year's Eve day. So it was like a quiet day, and at 8 in the morning, somebody broke through 2 glass doors and grabbed 3 pieces of artwork, mine being one of them, that was near the front entranceway, and it disappeared.
Wow.
And it's never shown up since. It's curious.
I can easily identify it. It's I have photographs of it, not of the break-in, but of the artwork.
Yeah, and tell us a bit about this one. What are the Hummingbirds doing?
Well, this is an example of work that has been pieced together from other pieces. The lower portion of it, now I'm going to talk about it practically and then I'll talk about it metaphorically. The lower piece of it was part of another piece that was again left over, but for my money, too interesting and also too time-consuming to produce, because the sewing takes a long time. One 16-inch diameter piece that I'm presently working on, we have 50 hours of just sewing in it. And that doesn't include making the materials that are being sewn together. So that was that lower part of the hand with the crisscrossing and the planets, which is sort of a metaphor for planets and also for science. It was attached to the rest of the hand from which the lower section, the silhouette, came from. And then the planets in the background above the fingertips and the two birds are a reference to our environment, I suppose to science in a way, but mostly to the delicacy of our environment. The hand being very big, the birds being small and delicate, the planets being somewhat in the distance. I'm very concerned about what we're doing to the planet to destroy it. And so some of my work, a lot of my work at the moment has to do with elements of nature and with an attempt to try to convey that feeling about concern about the well-being of the planet.
Yeah, do these things usually come together as sort of one process where you carry it through in a smooth sequence from beginning to end? Or
no, there are lots of foldering starts and stops.
And you're probably working on more than one thing at once then?
Yes. And what I do is I pin things up on these bulletin board walls, and then I keep moving them around. And what I like to do is to be able to live with something for a while to make sure that this is the right way it should go together. And I find that if I'm rushed, it doesn't work, and I have to undo. And there are times when there are deadlines that need to be met and so forth, and I find that I go back and undo some of the things that I did if I didn't have the proper, whatever proper means, amount of time to work with
Adequate amount of time.
Now, speaking of the environment, this is a piece about the Great Lakes. Maybe you can...
Oh, yeah. This piece took 2.5 months to produce. It's 7 by 9 feet in size. And I was invited by a prominent curator and gallery owner in Cleveland to do a piece for a show that he was putting together called Great Lake, Great Lake Erie, Imagining an Inland Sea. And with those words, Great Lake Erie, and of course Cleveland is right on Lake Erie, and imagining an inland sea, I realized I could not do something this big for that. So I knew I had to do something big. Then I started pondering about how would you emphasize the size of the lake, and it occurred to me to use the log pages of a steamship that had traveled the lake. The lake was an important transportation corridor, and it was also part of the lake's history was to have shipping on its surface. So these log pages, which are filled out by the captain at the end of each day, are the official document of the steamship for which they belong to. And this particular steamship is now a museum moored in Cleveland Harbor. So it's a museum to this
and this is one of the ore carriers from the Great Lakes. So of course that's
giant ship.
One of the reasons Cleveland is there, all this steel that was made there in the
correct, absolutely
industry, which they're still making actually.
So well, yeah, somebody
you worked in a steel mill.
I did.
At one point.
I labored in a mill for about 1.5 years.
And am I right that you got injured there, or that was something else? No.
I came close to being in. No, I didn't really.
Yeah.
I came a cable. We were lifting one of the giant. I worked in the laboring crew, which would repair the rolling mills, and the rolling mills are literally like they're mills with big steel rollers that are similar to a rolling pin, flattening out
it's
dough.
Like cookie dough or something.
Sort of like that, because they bring these hot ingots out of what they call the soaking pits, and they lay them on the conveyor belt. Or it's not a belt, but on this series of steel rollers, and roll them back and forth between, and squeeze these rollers down. Anyway, these things are giants, and these rollers that squeeze it down. And what they do is they produce out of an ingot that's the size of a shape of an automobile, they make a slab that's probably 14, 15 feet long and 6 inches thick and about 5 feet wide. So there's a lot of rolling to get it flat. Well, one of those rollers, we were putting a new roller in, and the cable snapped.
Oh my gosh!
That was holding it, and the snap actually put a mark on my jeans. It was that close to my skin.
Oh my gosh! Yeah.
But and then one other time, when they there was another form of rolling, where they make these, they call them spaghetti strips of steel. They're much smaller. And they would have, they come out of the mill red hot, but depending on the atmospheric conditions, once they're out and start to cool, but they're still red hot, they will cobble, and that means they just by themselves spontaneously go.
Oh,
And if
yeah.
you're standing next to one, you know, you've got this red hot thing that's, you've got to duck.
Yeah.
So I never got hit by one of those either, though. But those are,
Yeah.
those are two of the dangers.
But we're lucky you're here to still make art. What about this one here?
Oh, we're here.
It looks like a Good Valentines Day card.
this was inspired. This was a model that I worked with, who was just amazing, who I met quite by accident in a nightclub, and I took one photograph. The very first photograph I took of her, she was dancing alone on the dance floor. I mean, the dance floor was crowded. It wasn't. It was empty, but she didn't have a dance partner, and I sort of grabbed her wrist and I had a camera, and I showed. We couldn't even communicate because the decibel level was so high.
Yeah.
So she knew I wanted to take her photograph, and I led her over to an area where it was sort of a good place to take a photograph, although in a nightclub like that there isn't really a good place. And there were strobe lights going off. I handheld the shutter open, not knowing what exposure to use. This was a film camera. And miraculously I got an image, and I got her phone number, and then went back later to work with her over and over and over again. And it turns out she told me that a long time after that initial photograph that she realized she could not blink her eyes, because if she blinked her eyes on a long exposure, you would lose the definition of the eye. And I thought that was amazing. I mean, for me to meet somebody like that in that strange fashion, you know, that serendipitous fashion was just, it was almost like a miracle. I needed a model, but all of a sudden my path directly.
I remember seeing an interview with Michael Caine once where he was talking about acting, and you're not supposed to blink your eyes. So that's when I decided I wasn't going to be a movie star.
Pretty hard not
trying
not
to blink your eyes. It's harder than you think.
Well, let me go on to explain this piece that she has. I've done many portraits of her, and actually Alex Katz. She worked. She left Cleveland, went to New York City, and worked at Marlborough Gallery, which was the gallery that represented Alex Katz and a number of other well-known artists. And he met her, and he did a 12-foot painting of her head, which ended up in Interview magazine, and I have the issue.
Interesting.
I got the issue.
I'd love to see that.
So this piece is really about. It's about love. I mean, she's exuding sort of images of love out of the top of her head. Her head is perforated, as I use weird utensils to make my work. The perforations are really not that symbolic. They're mostly
I might say something that doesn't come through in these photographs, but there's a different level of sort of transparency or translucency to the materials.
Well, the background of this piece, actually the background of her, she's printed on transparent film, but the background is covered with gold leaf, well, not brass leaf, metal leaf, so that she has this gold metallic look to her. And then those two blocks, one on the left and one on the right, those two square panels, those are transparent material with metal leaf behind them as well. She's darker than the two rectangles or the squares on either side, but that's because I coated the surface with shellac to make it a darker kind of gold. And then the hearts are cut, actually it's a pair of woman's legs crossed wearing leopard designed hose. And yet in the magazine, that I found it in a magazine, the magazine with the legs crossed, it looked like a heart to me. So I just cut out that part.
Oh, interesting.
And then I've used that in a number of images. So it's basically about someone who's either sad, she looks sort of pondering and sad, and perhaps due to some a romantic mishap.
The whole use of gold in your work is a little bit similar to the kind of imagery you find in churches and so forth.
Well, I was raised in a Catholic, or I was brought up as a Catholic, and one of the things that I noticed in churches when I was at Mass, I mean, I loved the ceremony of the Mass, especially a high Mass, and the way the interior of the church was decorated with gilding and rich colors and so forth. So some of those colors worked their way into my work.
I wonder if, in just looking at this image that we're looking at on the screen right now, which is the detailed shot of your work, if you wouldn't mind, I hope that's okay that I just totally jumped in here, but if you wouldn't mind talking just a little bit about the technique by which you're sewing, because I can't help but notice upon a close inspection of your work, and after talking with a couple of people, that you're coming at the sewing from both sides of the paper or both sides of the material. Is that right? Like sometimes maybe you're running the machine this way and then maybe you would flip. Oh, it's always going through. Okay. It's it's hard for me to know because I don't know. I don't speak sewing machine.
You don't use a sewing machine.
Yeah.
No, it's always face up because
Okay.
that's the surface that I'm most concerned about.
Okay.
And what happens often just accidentally is the backs, as you mentioned earlier, become very interesting to look at. But but in fact, there was one case where I did a piece and I took it into my dealer in Cleveland and I said, well, which side do we show?
Right.
But normally the backs are, the fronts are more interesting than the backs.
Certainly more planned.
In a way, but there's a lot of serendipity. There's a lot
Yeah.
of, I rely heavily on accident.
Oh yeah.
Heavily on
Okay.
accident. And there can be good accidents and there can be bad accidents. But serendipity sort of permeates my life, and it permeates the way I compose my work because I'm constantly moving things around. I'll just start with a vague idea of what I want to do. And then I start experimenting, putting shapes in place and thinking, does this work or does that work better, and so forth.
Yeah.
So there's an awful lot of accident. And the accident comes through with the scraps that I use. Those are accidental. And some of those shapes really play an important role in the next piece.
Now,
So-
Romy, do you lay out your whole thing as sort of one thing and then sew it together, or do you improvise as you...
Yeah, I used to. I was I would create these incredibly detailed digital renderings knowing exactly this piece next to this piece, where then whenever I got through the printing process, I just became a machine where it's just I'm doing this thing, and as a result I have absolutely shifted to it being totally improvisational. And I rarely, unless I'm working with an image, like the image that is part of the postcard, which I see up on the screen right now, that's an actual photograph. So there's little improvisation there. I kind of looked at the photo and thought, well, that's a pretty amazing image, and this wall exists in Amarillo, and I want to capture that. But with the pieces where there's multiple photographs in place, it is starting with two things and then working improvisationally. And the reason for that, I like that you refer to it as an accident. I'm thinking of it more as improv because that keeps me more engaged with the process. Whereas before I was printing and just now I'm just assembling. Where in this process I can have more thought as I'm going through and kind of have to be engaged throughout the entire 20 to 2,000 hour process, depending on the size of the piece,
Now, this is probably a curveball question, but I'd be curious about how you want viewers to look at your work. Clearly, in both cases, it's almost as though you're making two images. If you stand back, you see an image of one sort, but if you go up close, you're led into a different kind of experience.
Well, I don't really, well, first of all, I like the fact that something can be appreciated in a slightly different fashion, looking at it closer, and as you back away from it, it changes. I don't think my work changes dramatically, but it does change somewhat. And it's similar to Chuck Close and those grid pieces that he does, where you look at that piece from a distance of 15, 20 feet, it's somebody's face, and you get up close to it, and it just becomes a series of patterns. I mean, he does it in a very different way. Because I think my work requires more scrutiny in order to have that happen. But I think the more visual delight, and hopefully that's the right word, the more visually delighting an image is on as many levels as possible, makes it a stronger piece of artwork. It has to keep giving back over and over and over again.
I think there's a discovery that happens, and I know that from a distance to look at my work, it would be pretty easy to just kind of generalize in a geometric abstraction kind of way, and it certainly is that discovery upon getting closer to the to realize that detail and think, oh yeah, look at all those tiny little stitches, you know, and it is a nice discovery that unfolds as you become more intimate with the work. And I think that that's a really natural experience for most people who are viewing art, is to have that experience from, you know, a few feet away, and then want to maybe get a little closer to understand the surface.
Well, it's
so
like looking
that.
at a sargent. You know, you see a sargent and you look at the brushwork when you get up close to it. It's amazing that that brushwork can describe that satin dress.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
it doesn't look like it would describe
Yeah.
anything but an abstract painting. And
Yeah.
Yeah.
so there is that sort of tradition in some cases.
Yeah.
Van Gogh, of course, with
Yeah.
the strokes that he makes, the painting marks.
Well, I think we're ready for questions from the audience. Yes.
Would you give me your overall impression of the students' work from Amarillo College that they did in response to their Skype interviews and their study of your work this semester?
Well, I thought that was a really innovative way to engage visiting artists with students, and it was a good experience, definitely. I enjoyed the interview process, and then seeing the work once it finally came through for us to look at it, really, you know, you certainly see the impact that Chris and I had on different students, and then you see their own innovations and ideas of how they're working with materials and giving their own voice to it, and I thought it was really great to see the variety of work, the details involved, and then and when any time when you're trying to jury or even look at work digitally, it's so different than when you can see it and look at it in person. And so there's a little bit of a leap of faith that goes into looking at something through a Google Drive and saying, well, yeah, this is probably really good, and let's look at it, and I like the ideas here, and then you see it in person. And these students have done an amazing job. There's really great work in the show, and it's nice to know that you can kind of inspire someone to push a media that they may not have even ever thought of exploring before.
And I thought that was very well put.
Yeah.
I don't know that I can add much except that I also believe that the work was really, really strong. And it is going to be hard to give mete out prizes. We'll figure a way, but very, very interesting translation of what we do. And as Romy pointed out, done in different ways, not necessarily done the way we would do it in our work. And that's also exciting,
Yeah.
that they took an idea and made it their own. They weren't just copying something that they saw that we did.
I saw your work in the gallery the other day, and one thing that really impressed me is how accessible it is. There are no frames. And also, Chris, you know, at the same time, being able to get so close and look so intimately at Romy's work, I found myself really wishing that your work was not in a frame. But I wondered if you all could talk about that.
Why don't you start with that?
Well, I agree entirely with you. I did a show at one point where the work was matted and mounted on the wall, but unframed and unglazed, so people could examine it. And in many ways, I invite people to touch the work when it's in a situation where you can't touch it if it's framed, but if it's unframed, I invite people to feel it. I think people like to touch it, and what I put it through in my studio is I contort that work. I hammer it. I use a blowtorch on it. I have some raw material that I leave on the floor to scuff up as I walk over it. So my point is that it's somewhat indestructible. Sure, you could scratch it, but I agree with you. It would probably, I would like to have it more visible and not have the barrier of the glazing over it.
So I think that there's a really interesting thing that happens with artists, and I feel fortunate that at this point that I have, in the opportunity of a museum exhibition where you do have that freedom to say, no, I don't, this is how it's going to be presented. That is certainly not the case generally within a commercial gallery setting where you're thinking more about a commercial gallery's needs and what they're trying to present to the public. But a museum, you get to have the voice you want. Chris's work came from a lot of different private collections where, You know, they have framed work in their homes or in their museums or their institutions, whereas all of my work is of my collection, so I have that option of saying no. First, I will say there are 4 pieces of Chris's that are unframed, and so you do get that intimacy with it, and it's pretty fantastic. Like, it really is great to be there right with it. And I think that that's just it. It's an accessibility where you put glazing in front of work, you put glass or you put plexi, and it just is, it's a barrier that I'm just not comfortable with. And I want people to have the connection with my work and with the detail of what the thread looks like without a barrier between it, in the same way that you would have a connection with your great-grandmother's quilt. And I think that that kind of feeling, that kind of tactile sensation is really important. And people do want to touch it. And we all know, as informed art viewers, that you should never touch art in a museum setting. However, should you do that, a clean pinky is a safe way to go about, because your pinky's not very strong, and hopefully your hands are clean and free of chocolate or something messy like that. So.
Well, I want to interject something. I've taken work to a frame shop, and some of my work is sewn into the backing on it. Or all of it is, because the normal hinging process is, the work doesn't lend itself to being attached to the backing board with the normal hinging process. So there are staple stitches that, I mean, they're hand done, but the artwork is stitched to the back. I've watched framers who will ponder over a piece, where do I put the hole? And they're so reluctant to actually put a hole in it. And I tell them, there are pinholes all over this piece, because I've been pinning it up on the wall. I found that the pinholes actually add character to the surface.
Yeah.
So they're so reluctant, because they're so used to handling things with kid gloves.
Yeah.
So
I might
sort of
say
amusing.
that's different about having worked in a museum. You know, you treat everything in this very sacred way, and it's sort of refreshing to be around artists who, you know, throw things on the floor and walk on them and that kind of thing. Actually, Andrew Wyeth, there was a show of his work at the Metropolitan Museum, and they wanted to put up the drawings in a way that made them seem very fresh, and he was suggesting just put them up with thumbtacks. Yeah. Of course, they figured out a much more complicated way. If you're a museum person, you can't just put it up with thumbtacks. You've got to do it in some perfectly
Now, if you look closely at
safe
my
way.
work, you'll see some footprints, because it does go on the floor, and if it's on the floor and it takes up all the floor space, and I need to get from this side of the room to that side of the room, like I walked on work maybe last night, I might have, that's possible. But yeah, it is. It's, I mean, really, the damage that, any damage that could happen, aside from physical scratching, which obviously would be not a good idea to do, but anything that could happen could probably be remedied.
Well, I had, let me add something to that, because I had a dealer wanting to take a picture of a piece of artwork that I had produced that had a metal leaf on the back of it. And he said, oh, we'll put tape loops on it, and we'll just stick it to a backing board while we take the photograph. And I said, well, I'm not so sure. It might pull off some of the leaf. He said, no, it'll be fine. So sure enough, it pulled off a big patch of leaf. But and I had to fix it, so I re-leafed it. But the starburst of what it pulled away actually added interest to the piece.
Yeah, that's
and
interesting.
there have been several accidents that have taken place with my work where it was easy to work the accident into the finished piece. As a matter of fact,
I'll just remember to mistreat your work from now on.
Well,
it will be a favor, I'm sure.
Henry wrote about my work, and the title of his essay is "The Beauty of Damage," because damage is so important to the way I produce my work.
Yeah.
Great title, I think he came up with.
Yeah.
Well,
Thank you.
it's so beautiful to even just think about the significance of that title in terms of how you're talking about how we are as humans, and how we all have scrapes, and we all have to kind of pull ourselves back up and get back through.
Well, you know what happened was that my paintings, which I mentioned earlier, were done meticulously with an airbrush so that they looked like they were perfect surfaces. One day I spilled a puddle of varnish on them because I was varnishing it, and I realized that after months of work on this painting, I'd ruined it, because there was no way I could pull that puddle up and not have it mar the surface. And that started me thinking about, I want to do work that I can make mistakes on and work that, do somewhat calculated mistakes, but work those mini tragedies into the finished piece.
Yeah.
Maybe someone else has a question out here.
My question comes from a rather novice point of view, but from hearing you talk, I understand that your work is printed on paper. I'm just trying to visualize, if I were to sew paper together, it would look like a crumpled mess. And you all work in such large scales. How do you do it? I mean, how does the process?
That's a great question.
You know.
Well, my work is and it never really came out in our discussion, but my work is on 3 layers of film. That there's a transparent layer that's about as thick as a piece of letter paper that the image gets transferred to. Then that gets laminated, just like you would go to Kinko's and laminate something. So there's a sandwich of 3 layers. So it ends up being about as thick as the material that a file folder is made out of. And so for me, and I'm sure it's true with Romy too, the thickness has to be, you're right, if you took a sheet of paper like this and tried to sew it, although I did sew magazine images together, and they seem to hold up. That was my early efforts with stitching. But I like the thickness of that. I think it's about 3 mils to be able to sew it and not have problems. And what becomes an issue sometimes, sometimes I have to take a piece apart because I realize that there were things in there that I didn't want. That later on, this was when I'm rushing and not giving it enough time. When I put it back together again, I have to go through exactly the same holes. And I'm using a machine, and a sewing machine that's turned by hand. It's an electric machine, but it's not treadle operated because the curvings and the nature of the stitching is such that if it was going too fast, I couldn't do it. But trying to go through those same holes again is a nightmare.
Yeah.
Otherwise, it would tear up. It would just make that whole edge look really faulty. Yeah. But
Yeah. No, I'm just thinking about why I don't use a sewing machine and how challenging that situation would be. Like if I go through and I pierce my holes, and I do that with some thimbles and a pretty thick needle, and I go through and poke and pierce, and then I go through and thread.
You're working on material that's about as thick as a file folder?
Well, yeah, I'm using 300-pound digital rag paper, and so it's a pretty thick, sturdy,
right.
Inkjet.
And it's
paper.
very precise the way you do the sewing.
Yeah.
Yeah, it is.
But if I don't like my thread, or if I'm not happy with my stitch or something, I can rip it out, and it's not the challenge of trying to make it go back through. And like, oh, wow, I couldn't. I think I'm an exceedingly patient person. I am not that patient. Not. No.
This is for Romy. You talk about being drawn to places. You said buildings that were built with an intent that are now abandoned or falling apart. Does that play into how you make your work? Is it made to be archival, or is it made to one day fall apart?
Yeah, that's a really great question.
Yeah, that is a good question.
And I think about this a lot with my work and with my presentation of my work and my treatment of my work. I make my work with archival material, and I do have a high attention to detail in terms of wanting it to last as long as possible, knowing full well what I think we all know, which is that nothing lasts forever. I mean, of course we have examples of art and architecture that are, thousands and tens of thousands, and that is fantastic. I don't really anticipate that my work will probably last 10,000 years. I think that's really not likely at all. But the good thing is none of us will be around to know that, and I don't have to worry about those things right now. I do think about things in terms of, historic preservation, with the idea that, if you can make photographic work specifically, which is a very fragile media, last 400 years, then you're ahead of the game, because even when you think about the advent of photography and how long photography's been around, the images that we do have that are those oldest images are so delicately cared for because they're fragile and they're not going to last forever. And so I have a really ephemeral approach to my work in that regard of I want it to last as long as possible, but really I want people to have an experience with it, and then that memory hopefully will retain, and I'm satisfied with that. Yeah.
We've got time for just, oh, go
I
ahead.
wanted to add something to that. There's a German artist whose name is Anselm Kiefer who works with materials that are break down, straw and tar and salt on lead and so forth, that will not remain the same over time. And I had an interesting conversation with a conservator who works with 3 museums in Northeast Ohio to repair any damage on artwork. And he said if the artist's intent, and this is Kiefer's intent, is that things break down because life breaks down. We don't last forever. If the artist's intent is to have the work change over time, that it is that this conservator has written extensively on this, and actually he helped the Cleveland Museum of Art pick out the Anselm Kiefer they bought. He said then there's nothing wrong with that, if that's the initial intent. And there are a number of artists who work that way. Robert Rauschenberg's, some of his stuff, I've seen photographs of a piece over time that there are elements of it that have deteriorated, and you can see it clearly if somebody records it photographically over time. So, I mean, there is that thought process along with the one of preserving it forever.
I want to just tack one more little add-on to that, which is in thinking about the ephemeral nature and this idea of material. Like, one of the things that I love to do and wish that and know that I will have the opportunity again to do, but is to present work in windows where sun is hitting it, because there's this beautiful thing that happens as light passes through, and there's this translucence of the material, and it becomes very like almost a stained glass effect. And I think it's beautiful, and I love that experience, and that is great. All of my decision making in this is informed by an experience that I've had as an assistant to a dear friend, artist friend of mine, who, Jason Hackenworth, makes giant, large room size installations out of latex balloons, and they're meant to last for a month, maybe 2, but you see this decay over time. And that experience with working with a very ephemeral, very limited time, like that really has informed my experience with making my own art, and that I know that my work is going to last longer than Jason's does. Like, this is an experience that you get to see and have and watch this shrivel, this very organic thing happen. But, you think about light and photography, and if you hang a photograph in a window long enough, the sun is going to bleach it, and it's going to change, and it's going to break down faster. And I kind of like that. I think that that's neat. I would love to see that change over time. Yeah.
Well, thank you.
Thank you, Henry.
Thank you.
And Romy. Thank you all for coming.